Hi everyone, I'm Sosteen. Welcome to my channel. This is Elspeth. Today we're going to talk about making tiny corsets. How many of you had an American Girl doll growing up, or got one for your kid, or admired them from afar? So growing up, I had Felicity. If any of you are wondering why I'm so obsessed with the 18th century, and in particular Robella Franceses, Felicity is the reason. So I've been meaning to remake some of her gowns for a while, but currently Historic Heroine and Couture Courtesan on Instagram as well as YouTube have been doing such an incredible job. I don't know that I particularly feel the need to do it again myself because they've already hit perfection. However, one accessory that Felicity had that I've always coveted was a fashion doll. In the 18th century, when rich people wanted a certain fashion, they would sometimes get a doll ahead of time so that they would know exactly what the real fashion plates look like. While fashion plates like images were around, they were relatively uncommon until the late 18th century, and moreover, they couldn't really show the exact material or texture or certain details, so dolls were preferred. The most incredible thing about these dolls is not only did they just show how cool the fashions were, they were dressed by tailors. The rich and powerful, like Queen Anne, collected them and would frequently have her own tailor make all the clothing and the little art undergarments and everything for these dolls. And some of these dolls have survived until today, and oftentimes we learn about the full-size clothing from these dolls, simply because they're the only surviving example of a certain garment. So while the full-size clothing were probably reused and cut up to make new things, these small ones were too small, so they would just kind of leave them. For instance, the little lace headpieces worn on 1690s mantuas called fontages, to my knowledge and research, I've never seen an extant except on dolls. So it's amazing how much we can learn about clothing construction from these dolls. For instance, this particular doll named Lady Clapham even has her own extant fontage, and we can learn about how they looked from the back, for example, from this doll. May I add that she and her life partner, Lord Clapham, who currently reside in the V&A, have the most incredible tiny wardrobe. Look at her tiny clock stockings and small little garters. She even has tiny pockets and stays. And look at that petticoat with the tiny quilting. It's mind-boggling. Also, just a note about Lord Clapham. Look at his awesome tiny breeches. Note that he comes with both a casual outfit as well as a more formal one, as does Lady Clapham. I've been meaning to make a fashion doll for myself for years, and I finally decided to do it with the urging of several friends. So I would like to take a moment to thank and blame in equal measure modern Marie Antoinette, Lauren from Wearing History, AJ, also known as Confused Kitty, who is the one who gifted me the awesome macaroon pattern weights, as well as Lauren from Costumer's Closet. For those of you who don't know, ball jointed dolls, or BJD for short, are resin dolls with removable eyes and wigs, and they are really fantastic fashion dolls since they can be posed, balanced, and dressed however you like. Moreover, since their hair and eyes are removable, you can make them wigs and you can change their eyes up, so you can make dressing them really easy and make them whatever period you want. I decided I really wanted one, but there are so many different companies to choose from. While I was browsing, I came upon Bimong, who has several dolls of different styles. Of note, he has one called Nare 1412, and the one thing I love about this doll is not just the subtle smile, but the fact that she's Asian, and probably even Korean, like me. I've never had an Asian doll, and I was thrilled at the prospect of having a doll that looked kind of like me. Honestly, it actually made me cry because I've never had a doll that looked like me in my life, and I didn't even know I lacked for it. So, just a heads up, representation matters. These dolls aren't really your standard dolls. Since they're fully posable, they do tend to be a work of art and are quite expensive. However, so are these fashion dolls in the past, so I decided to just go ahead and do it. I got my doll, and you'll notice they come unpainted and without eyes and hair. I immediately sent her off to an artist called Milkweeds and Honey to get a face-up, or rather her face painted. While I will show that part later, I did get started on her underthings in the meanwhile. Now, while BJDs can come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, the one I got is an MSD scale, or 1:4 scale, or about 14 to 15 inches tall. Once I had her in my hands, I started sewing her a little shift in the softest and lightest linen I could possibly find. Please note that I hate making shifts. In fact, I didn't even make mine. I hired it out. However, I was so happy to do it for my doll, and it was so much more fun to do it for her. I decided to name her Evelina Toki after the character by Francis Burney and the Korean word for rabbit. Now, before I get to the sewing, I'd like to take a moment to thank my sponsor, Skillshare, for paying for my doll. No, you have to jump up. There we go. So I'm sure you've heard me talk about Skillshare before, since I use them to learn practically everything. Skillshare is an online learning platform that has thousands of online classes that you can take in a myriad of different topics, as varied from filming to cooking to drawing to time management. Most recently, I've been using their calligraphy classes. I really like this class called Learn Gothic / Blackletter Calligraphy Series 2 Majuscule by JX Calligraphy Ortiz Nonong. Not only does she show and describe how to do the calligraphy, she also has downloadable worksheets that come with the class. She goes through the sheets describing how to do each little line and flourish. The printouts work really well, and I've been having a great time doing these classes with her. Best part, each class after the initial exercises is only 6 to 8 minutes long, so it's been really easy to set aside some time every single day to learn. It's how I've learned to do a lot of things, including video editing, like the kind you're watching right now, as well as my fanciful green screen editions. Skillshare is affordable at less than $10 a month with an annual subscription. The first 1,000 people to use a link in my description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership so you can explore your creativity. Thank you, Skillshare, for sponsoring my video. Now let's work on dressing this girl. To make the shift, I did the typical 18th century thing, which is to take a long piece of linen, cut gussets out, and then sew those gussets onto the bottom side so that you have a flared trapezoid. Sew the sides together and then add the sleeves. I even put tiny gussets on the sleeves, which actually made me so happy to see. I then folded over the tiny hems and sewed them flat. Just to compare, here's my shift and here's Lady Clapham's shift. Please note we both have tiny gussets, but other than that, there's some difference. Mine is more of a 1780s, which has a straight arm, and hers is slightly earlier, which has gathered. And it's gathered all the way to the edge, and then you can see the tiny little holes that you tie with this piece of string. I also want to add that her gathers are just so beautiful and typical of an earlier shift. I also want to say that because she's a little larger, they can add a lot more detail. She's actually 22 inches versus mine, which is about 14 inches. It actually is about the same size difference between Evelina and Yvonne, a doll I recently got from another company called Nikana. The size difference is considerable and lets you get a lot more detail in with the larger doll. However, I do love how tiny things get for Evelina, so that's another bonus. Meanwhile, while the face was getting painted, I did start work on the under things, namely the stays and the pocket. Let's start with the stays. Now, these are technically stays, not corsets. But however, in the modern language, I understand that corset has come to encompass stays because that's how most people would interpret a pair of stays if they saw them in a museum. Just letting you know that I will be referring to these as stays for the duration of this video because that's what really comes naturally to my tongue. However, you can call them whatever you want. For the stays, I started with the Augusta stays pattern by Scroop Patterns, made by the incredible Dreamstress, partnered with my friend and senpai, Amber from Lady of the Wilderness. The nice thing about their patterns is that they offer digital downloads. And one of the things they let you download is not just the page-by-page pattern, but the huge sheet that you can bring to a print shop to have them print out. Now, the great thing about this is it's very easily resizable. So I opened this up in Adobe Acrobat and went to print and went to poster tab. And in that size window, I shrunk it down to 20%. The way that I figured the sizing for this was simple. Math! The actual size stays has a front length of about 12.5 inches. And I wanted my stays to be about 2.5 inches long in the front from bust to where I wanted it to sit. So 2.5 is about 20% of 12.5%. So I printed this out at 20% scale, which conveniently fit on printer paper. Initially, I just printed it out in the smallest corset size, but I quickly realized it was too small to fit Evelina, who is quite busty. So then I measured Evelina's bust and waist measurements, multiplied them by 5. This gave me a pattern measurement of size 38, curvy. However, I went with one size smaller, 36, since I wanted the corset to have a gap in the back for lacing. So I printed that out again and cut out the printer paper with a pair of paper scissors. I also printed a mirror image of the same pattern, and I used Scotch tape to tape all the pieces together. And now I had a tiny paper corset to use as a mock-up. I tried this on Evelina's headless body, the head being currently with the face-up artist, and it fit perfectly. So I put the doll away so I wouldn't have to look at her headless body, and I started on the actual stays. Now, in reality, making stays, you need multiple layers of linen, buckram, fashion fabric, lining, etc. Often about 3 to 4 layers in all. I decided to not go for that since the same fabric used on a doll would be disproportionately thick. So instead, I decided to go for 2 layers. One for the fashion outer layer, and I used a double-faced silk Duchess for that, which is very tightly woven and has a lot of strength, so I thought could handle the tension. For the inner layer, I used a cotton muslin. I used this because it was thin but yet surprisingly strong and tightly woven, and much more tightly woven than any linen in my collection. So I pinned the linen to the silk Duchess and then traced out the stays pattern using friction pen. I used pen to draw out the lines where I wanted the boning to go, using the guides given on the stays pattern. I'd be lying if I said I had an exact measurement of how wide I want the channels to be, but I mostly aim for somewhere between 2 to 3 millimeters wide. I then went to my sewing machine and adjusted the stitch length down to 0.6 to 0.8 millimeters. Usually I sew at 2.5 millimeters length, so this is really a small stitch. Luckily, my Baby Lock Soprano is really good about this. So I initially started by going around the outline of the stays, leaving gaps at the bottom or the top depending on where I needed to put the boning in. Once the outline was in, I then sewed the channels. I initially did the back and forth thing for the ends of the stay channels, but I quickly realized that due to the tiny stitch length, it was really unnecessary. This is not going to unravel. So the way that 18th century stays are sewn is you sew all these different pieces and then you kind of like fold over the edges and you bone them and then you sew them together. So to make things interesting for myself, I started with the front panel. It was time to bone the channel. To do this, I got 4mm synthetic whalebone from Burnley and Trowbridge and used a pair of plastic cutters from Citadel to cut the boning in half. I then cut the edges of the stays using pinking shears in order to keep the edges from fraying too much. I then folded over the edges of the stays and used a whip stitch to sew down the seam allowance on the wrong side of the fabric. Then I got an awl and very carefully made tiny holes for the eyelets. Once both sides were completely done, I sewed the bottom half of the stays together at the center front, below the eyelets. Please note that above the halfway point there is lacing so that the woman can better fit their bosom. At this point would be the time to add the straps. However, I really didn't want straps for this one because the straps really aren't necessary, and I thought that it would add some bulk on her shoulder, which I really didn't want. I started binding them by using 1/8 inch silk taffeta ribbon to cover up the seams in the center front and the side front. Normally this would be done on all the areas, but I thought this was sufficient since it already looked pretty good. Then I got 1/4 inch silk taffeta ribbon and started carefully sewing it to the top and bottom edge of the stays. I used tiny stitches about 8 to 15 to the inch depending on the area to carefully stitch it down. After I was done sewing on the edging, I was completely done with the little stays. Meanwhile, I decided to make her a tiny pocket as well. You'll notice Mrs. Clapham has one, so it was only right that Evelina have one too. Of course, Evelina's will be embroidered because it's me. I already have a set digitized based on a beautiful accent at the V&A, and it was really easy to size it down for my doll. So to make it, I got some cotton batting-like fabric called Damette. I used this behind some silk scraps I had in the house and hooped it. I then stitched it out on my baby lock venture. May I add that BJD as a hobby is a fantastic way of using all your silk scraps? Sometime later, I had tiny little pockets. I cut this out with a 1/4 inch seam allowance around the edge. At the center slit, I used a very tiny zigzag stitch, so I simply cut as close to that line as possible and it did not fray. I then backed it with some cotton muslin using 1mm stitches to stitch out the edge and then sewed the two layers together. I then cut out the pocket as close as possible to that seam line and then used a zigzag stitch to protect the outer edge from further fraying before I bound it. Finally, I got some 1/2 inch silk taffeta ribbon and then sewed it as a binding around the edge of the pocket as well as the top to sew to the waistband. Lady Clapham wears only one pocket, and so Evelina will only have one as well. Now, I'm not quite done with all of her other underwear. She still needs an under petticoat, a bum roll, a pair of panniers or pocket hoops, a quilted petticoat, and I also need to make her some embroidered garters. But I think this is a very good and natural stopping point. While I was finishing this, I got the face up in the mail from Milkweeds and Honey, and I love her so much. She was so cool. She sent me a picture of every single layer as she was doing it. And I had sent her a picture of Madame de Pompadour and myself and said, can you combine the two and kind of go for that? And I think she did it to perfection. I love how realistic she's made her. The cheeks and lips are slightly rouge, which is perfect for 18th century. And I just love everything she did. So I finally put my doll together and I started dressing her. And that's it. I'm just so in love with these tiny stays. I'm so proud of them. They're probably my best ones I've ever made, and they're not even for me. Now I have this. I need to make her a full wardrobe, starting with a red and goat based on mine, of course. And that should be coming up in the next few months. So thanks so much for watching. I'll be back next Tuesday with a video about the making of another Madame de Pompadour gown. If you like this video, please remember to like and subscribe. Gideon, 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 come on up. Gideon. Oh, come on, Douglas. Currently, I'm trying to talk these guys into hanging out with me more. Like, I'm trying to train them, so I always have some treats in my pocket because, honestly, they're not really the cuddly type of dogs, and they just kind of, like, live in the house with me sometimes, and I feel like I just live with another married couple. Like, guys.